Welcome to my channel, Celebbuzzz. For many years, people thought the trips of the spaceship Enterprise were about working together, friendship, and being brave. But behind the nice TV episodes, there were fights, big egos crashed into each other, and anger sometimes pushed the actors to their limit. William Shatner, the man who played Captain Kirk, was right in the middle of both the good times and the bad times. Now that he's older, he talks honestly about those days, showing a truth very different from the hero adventures that amazed the whole world. A childhood full of excitement. William Shatner's life started in Montreal, Canada, on March 22, 1931, during a really big snowstorm. His mother had to give birth at home because the roads were blocked with snow. Right from the start, his story had lots of surprises and excitement, like fate was getting him ready for a life on stage. When he was 8 years old, Shatner was already going to a kids' acting school run by a well-known Canadian actress. At just 10 years old, he was acting professionally in radio shows like The Magic Flute for CBC. Soon after, people praised him for playing Tom Sawyer in a local stage show where critics were amazed by how good he was on stage. Even though he had early talent, Shatner's school life was bumpy. At McGill University in 1948, he studied economics, a smart choice to make his parents happy, but he never really fit in lecture halls. He said years later that he rarely went to classes, finding his real love in the campus theater. By 1950, he had written and acted in a student play that became so popular, it got him attention from CBC producers. That was his first time on television, a small taste of the TV career that was coming. In 1956, Shatner took his biggest risk yet. He moved to New York City to chase acting full-time. His Broadway debut came with Tamburlaine the Great, which only lasted 20 shows. Even though the show failed, the experience was very important. Young Canadian with no formal training had made it to the New York stage. From there, Shatner began building a resume on American television during the late 1950s and early 1960s. He appeared in shows like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Defenders, and The Outer Limits. But it was his 2 times on The Twilight Zone, especially the 1963 episode, Nightmare at 20,000 FT, that showed his ability to play characters falling apart under pressure. This skill for showing tension and barely controlled panic would later become central to his most famous role, becoming Captain Kirk. By 1965, William Shatner was steadily working in television, but nothing suggested he was about to take on the role that would define his life. At that time, Star Trek already had a captain. Jeffrey Hunter played Christopher Pike in the original pilot called The Cage. NBC bosses, however, said no to it, claiming the show was too slow and brainy. Instead of canceling the idea, they did something unusual. They ordered a second pilot. Hunter chose not to return, reportedly to focus on movies, though Shatner later hinted there may have been deeper fights behind his leaving. With the role suddenly empty, producers turned to Shatner. He was shown the rejected pilot, and while he liked the production values, he thought the acting was way too stiff. He believed the captain needed a more relatable, lighter touch. When Shatner stepped in as James T. Kirk in 1966, he reimagined the character as both commanding and friendly. He wanted Kirk to be curious about the unknown, excited about exploring, yet relaxed enough to joke with his crew. Instead of yelling rigid commands, Kirk could lean toward a helmsman and casually say, "Take us left, George." This sense of ease made him different from the typical military types on television at the time. To shape Kirk's personality, Shatner drew on 2 inspirations. One was Horatio Hornblower, the naval hero known for being smart and brave. The other was Alexander the Great, a role Shatner himself had played in a failed 1963 TV pilot. He brought Alexander's mix of charm and authority to Kirk. The addition of humor, something Shatner insisted on, further softened the edges. Unlike many science fiction heroes, Kirk wasn't just a cold planner. He was someone viewers could laugh with and trust. The gamble paid off. When Star Trek started in September 1966, Kirk quickly became a standout. The character showed courage and hope during a crazy decade, and audiences connected with his never-giving-up confidence. Yet, even as the show gained loyal fans, life behind the cameras was far from peaceful. For Shatner, stepping into command meant more than leading the make-believe crew of the Enterprise. It also meant dealing with real-world rivalries that threatened to tear the cast apart. Fights, feuds, and sabotage. While viewers saw teamwork on screen, the reality behind the Star Trek set was often messy. William Shatner's ambition, his constant rewrites, and his need to be in the spotlight created tension that sometimes exploded into open conflict. What fans never knew at the time was that the friendships shown on screen were strained by jealousy and anger just a few feet away from the cameras. One early problem came during the filming of The Man Trap in September 1966. Leonard Nimoy, whose character Spock was becoming unexpectedly popular, found himself fighting with Shatner. Believing Nimoy was stealing attention, Shatner deliberately walked into Nimoy's shots, not once, but 17 times, forcing expensive retakes. The director was furious, and Nimoy threatened to walk off the set if it continued. It was one of the first cracks in the illusion of unity. Clashes weren't limited to petty rivalries. In March 1968, while shooting The Paradise Syndrome, Shatner and Nimoy exploded into a heated argument over how Captain Kirk's memory loss should be shown. Shatner wanted drama and intensity, while Nimoy argued for being subtle. The standoff delayed production for hours until creator Gene Roddenberry stepped in to calm both men. Writers were equally frustrated. During The Trouble with Tribbles in 1967, Shatner and Nimoy spent 14 straight hours rewriting dialogue, cutting other characters' lines in the process. By the third season, cast members half-jokingly called the program The Shatner-Nimoy Show. Even groundbreaking moments were not free from tension. In 1968's Plato's Stepchildren, the script called for a kiss between different races, between Shatner's Kirk and Nichelle Nichols's Uhura, a bold move for American television. Shatner reportedly worried about audience backlash and asked for an alternate version without the kiss. Nichols, however, believed in the scene's importance and worked with Shatner to sabotage every non-kiss take, forcing the studio to broadcast the historic moment. Beyond creative battles, the grueling schedule added fuel to the fire. Episodes sometimes required 16 to 22 hours of filming, leaving cast and crew exhausted. In October 1968, during the Tholian Web, Shatner himself broke down after 18 hours on set, throwing his script in frustration and refusing to continue until given rest. Even the captain of the Enterprise could not escape the crushing demands of the show, The Price at Home. While William Shatner commanded the bridge of the Enterprise with confidence, his private life was falling apart. The endless hours on set didn't just strain his body and his relationships with fellow actors, they tore into his family. Shatner's first marriage to Canadian actress Gloria Rand had begun in 1956 with hope and stability. Together they had 3 daughters, Leslie in 1958, Elizabeth in 1961, and Melanie in 1964. But by the late 1960s, the pressures of Star Trek left little room for being a father or husband. The production schedule was merciless. Shatner would leave home before dawn for makeup and often return long after midnight. He later admitted that between 1966 and 1969, he missed 217 family dinners. On Christmas Day in 1967, while most families gathered around trees and gifts, he was on set filming reshoots for The Gamesters of Treselyan. On April 12, 1968, he missed his daughter Elizabeth's school play because he was locked in yet another rewriting session. His absence became the rule, not the exception. Gloria's patience wore thin with each missed milestone. Birthdays passed, without him there. Holidays went uncelebrated, and even simple weekends together became impossible. Shatner himself admitted in a 2018 interview that the guilt of those years still weighs heavily on him. In June 1969, just weeks after Star Trek was canceled, Gloria filed for divorce. She cited his constant absences and emotional distance, explaining that it felt like she was raising their children alone. The timing was cruel. At the very moment his family collapsed, so too did his career. Shatner had sacrificed his home life for a role that no longer existed. Instead of returning to a stable household for comfort, he faced an empty home and 3 daughters living with their mother in Beverly Hills. His attempts to reconnect often fell short, and although he remained close to his children in later years, those lost weekends, 47 in total, he calculated, became painful reminders of the cost of fame. The man who had become a cultural symbol of leadership and strength was, in truth, a husband and father, watching the most important parts of his life slip away. And as the cameras stopped rolling, the real struggle for survival was only beginning. From homelessness to revival. When Star Trek ended in 1969 after just 3 seasons, William Shatner's life collapsed almost overnight. The show had built a small but loyal following. Yet, it wasn't enough to keep it alive. And once it was canceled, Shatner faced a problem, familiar to many actors. Typecasting. He was no longer seen as a versatile performer. To casting agents, he was Captain Kirk, and only Captain Kirk. In the early 1970s, jobs became scarce. The man once hailed as the next Marlon Brando was now reduced to taking whatever parts he could find, often in low-budget horror or exploitation films like Big Bad Mama, The Devil's Reign, and Kingdom of the Spiders. These roles didn't build his career. They only paid the bills barely. With his daughters living with Gloria in Beverly Hills, Shatner was left struggling to make ends meet. At one point, he was so broke that he lived out of a camper parked in the San Fernando Valley. He later referred to this time simply as that period, too painful to describe in detail. To scrape by, he would make appearances at small parties or minor events, even wrapping up old possessions like his Star Trek phaser, to give as Christmas presents to his daughters because he couldn't afford new gifts. The humiliation of those years stayed with him for decades. Everything changed in 1977 when Star Wars exploded into theaters. Paramount realized it had its own space property waiting to be revived. By 1979, Star Trek, the motion picture, premiered. With a $35 million budget, one of the most expensive films ever made at the time. At 48 years old, Shatner returned as Captain Kirk, thinner from losing 25 pounds through strict dieting, determined to reclaim his career. The film earned $139 million worldwide. Not a runaway hit, but enough to prove there was still life in the franchise. True redemption came with Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan in 1982. The leaner budget forced stronger storytelling, and Shatner's Kirk, now older and more vulnerable, resonated deeply. Critics praised his performance, and suddenly, the man who had been homeless just a few years earlier was back at the helm of a cultural juggernaut. Reflection, regret, and resilience. By the mid-1980s, William Shatner had rebuilt his reputation, not only through the Star Trek films, but also with a new television role in T.J. Hooker. As Sergeant Thomas Jefferson Hooker, he once again played a commanding figure, this time on the streets rather than in space. The series drew solid ratings and reminded audiences that Shatner could carry more than one role. Off camera, he pushed himself relentlessly, often doing his own stunts. The physical demands left him with broken ribs, concussions, and the beginnings of chronic back pain that would haunt him into old age. Yet, even as he pushed forward, Star Trek remained both his salvation and his shadow. The cast's resentment never fully disappeared. George Takei, James Doohan, and others spoke publicly about Shatner's domineering behavior. While Shatner himself admitted that insecurity had fueled some of his choices, the tension between him and Leonard Nimoy remained complicated. They collaborated, argued, and sometimes stopped speaking altogether. By the time Nimoy died in 2015, the two were estranged, a loss Shatner described as one of the deepest regrets of his life. His later success on Boston Legal from 2004 to 2008 gave him a new identity outside science fiction. As Denny Crane, he blended comedy with tragedy, earning 2 Emmy Awards. But by then, the physical toll of his career was undeniable. Hearing loss from years on noisy sets, severe arthritis, and constant back pain became part of his daily reality. In interviews, he admitted that fear of loneliness, more than pain, was what weighed on him most. Now, in his 90s, Shatner has spoken with rare honesty about what really happened on the Star Trek set. He acknowledges the sabotage, the fights, and the ego battles, admitting they came from his own drive to stay in the spotlight. "I failed sometimes," he said plainly, "but I was always trying to keep the show alive." The fearless Captain Kirk, who once represented the best of humanity, was behind the camera as a man struggling to balance ambition, insecurity, and the crushing demands of fame. It is this complexity, the hero on screen, the flawed human off it, that has finally been revealed. William Shatner's journey proves that even legends carry scars. The man who embodied courage and leadership was also vulnerable to fear, rivalry, and regret. Now at 93, his candor allows fans to see not just Captain Kirk, but the man behind the uniform, a man who paid a heavy price for the role that defined him. Do you think William Shatner was unfairly judged by his castmates, or did his ambition truly make him the villain of the Star Trek set?